I'm extremely pleased to welcome our four speakers today. I'd also like to thank David Velasco, who is here and has been incredibly instrumental in, basically fostering many of the dialogues and issues we're going to discuss here today. And of course, also Tino Segal, with whom we had many conversations. One of the things I wanted to say from the outset is that I think a lot of issues about these panels have to do with the fact that maybe it's no longer necessary to make a decision. It's something Alexandra said this morning. I think one of the great things is that we live, as David Deutsch said, in a world now of parallel realities, and it's possible, to be both in the world of choreography and in the world of art and in many other worlds, at the same time. So we're not going to talk today so much about transfer, but I think what is interesting is this idea of the world of exhibitions more and more having a presence of choreography, lately. And I think maybe one of the most interesting texts which articulates why this might be the case comes from the German art historian Dorothea von Hantelmann. It's a book which she has not yet published, but she presented it at our Swiss Pavilion in a series of vignettes. And I just wanted to sort of, set the scene, summarize a few of these thoughts actually Dorothea expresses. Obviously, the exhibition being a key ritual of the modern age means that the crowd of people is no longer addressed as a crowd, but as a number of individuals. And that marks a very big difference to theater, concert, also any kind of, lecture where, basically you have one or a very few people speaking to a crowd. With the exhibition, it's a much more individualized ritual. And as Dorothea said, it sort of, ruptures with this idea of a pre-modern sort of homogenizing attention, right? So it's a more democratic or liberal kind of ritual. However, with all the advantages that comes along with, the ritual of the exhibition has actually also many disadvantages. And Dorothea quotes particularly one text by Margaret Mead, which the legendary anthropologist, who in her critique of the exhibition criticizes that the exhibition doesn't address all the senses. That, it basically has a structural deficit or a structural problem because it does not tie, it does not create connection. And that sort of idea, how we can overcome this idea of actually a primacy of the visual art object and maybe focus more on people, is obviously very much at stake. What's happening in the world of exhibitions right now. And for me, as a curator, the first awareness of that happened actually when in 1999 we did the exhibition Laboratorium in Antwerpen with Barbara van der Linden, where we declared the city of Antwerpen a kind of laboratory, and then had within Antwerpen also a choreography laboratory by Xavier Le Roy. So we could say ESW, XL. Everything started with Xavier Le Roy. And in some kind of way, it was in this, in this very first encounter we had, and Xavier installed this, laboratory, that one of his young collaborators in this group was Tino Segal, how that first meeting happened. Then in 2000, January the 1st, I had a phone call from Matthew Barney, with whom I worked a lot in the 90s. And Matthew said, we wished each other a happy new millennium. And many of you might have seen the film last night, and basically you see there what he announced in January 2000. He said, he had a very strong desire towards live experience. And obviously that means also rituals, something the 14 Rooms also addresses, rituals which somehow, to quote the last time Dorothea, would be able to create ties and still kind of remain, democratic and liberal, rituals which are more holistic. And Margaret Mead says, maybe that has more to do with a medieval mass or with a Bali ritual than it would have necessarily to do, with the format of the exhibition, only focusing on that idea of, the visual kind of primacy. So I'm very happy that we have the four speakers here with us today. All the four of them have actually explored in their work a lot of these issues, and it would be great maybe to have four introductions to their work, to what they're doing, and then we will open it up to a conversation and discuss. Also, one of the things I want to discuss today, which I think will be very interesting, is to see how such time-based works can actually travel over time, because obviously we know how objects travel, they are being preserved. But we, in some kind of way, still very open how actually such time-based work travels. Do they travel through documentation? Do they travel through scars? What do we do with the scar of the scar? Pierre Boulez always says, and something Alexandra said this morning at breakfast, the scar is actually only a very small part of it. There is all this additional information, the artist has to write down, which Boulez calls the scar of the scar. And I think it will be very fascinating to see how the four of you, feel about that. So maybe we can start with Alexandra Bachzetsis, who is actually born in Zurich, has as an artist, as a performer, and a choreographer, worked very systematically in both fields. As you said this morning, you didn't make a decision. It's always been a parallel realities. And I wanted to just begin with and ask you a little bit, what were your inspiration when you started? Who were your kind of triggers or first kind of, Auslöser?
So I think my biggest kind of inspiration in that sense always were people and what constitutes the presence of somebody. And in that sense, I'm interested in different forms of expression that comes along with a culture of movement or a culture of gestures. And then in that sense, in a way, I was always interested in tracing back and figuring out the history of those gestures, or like where they are kind of embedded in and how they come along and how you do inherit such or how you can sort of acquire it. And of course, there were also people existing that made amazing work, and they're also totally relevant, and you look up to them and you get interested by their works and their questions. And in that sense, Yvonne Rainer was someone that I thought was very important because of what she pointed out in terms of like being interested in getting away of the stylization of the dancer and like looking into what reveals people fully. And that was something I thought was such a human attempt towards a certain kind of established idea of choreography, or an established idea of what a dancer should look like or should represent. And of course, there's also like a lot of people who then somehow made work since the 70s that relates to this. But I think for me, more important, I am very interested in contemporary phenomena and how those, in a way, are intertwined with a certain kind of history, and then in formulating ideas that are relevant with regard to these phenomena, in a way, and try to look into the more kind of playful way of embodying such, or like how the game of like entering a certain fantasy, of being someone else's fantasy, or being mirror image of something, and sort of start to create a certain self-empowered reality with regard to that.
And how would you say that then the world of exhibitions enter? Because you have done exhibitions. I mean, very often your works exist both in museums or in galleries, and then they exist also in the world of dance and choreography. And actually, the same pieces have different incarnations. They're different when you do them in the art world than when you do them in the world of dance and choreography. But then at a certain moment, you started to come into the world of exhibitions with that kind of duration, which is obviously not the performance, but it has another form of duration. I think it happened with a work called Handwerk. Can you tell us a little bit how that began?
So, well, to take this example of Handwerk, that was a commissioned piece from a commercial gallery, Juliet Jongma in Amsterdam in 2005. And I wanted, therefore, because there was this kind of question to make something for a gallery space that eventually could also sell work that is nevertheless choreographic and ephemeral work, and I wanted to very much also keep it there. I thought I wanted to address the idea of like selling body in the market, or like what sells in choreography and what is that is in a way the material that I work with, which in the end is people in some way. So then I thought I wanted to make a pole dance performance, which comes from the idea of like, or where it sort of got stuck was more in this kind of erotic, slightly vulgar, connoted aspect of the red light district and kind of nightclub situation. And I was interested in the idea of what is that economy of the body that sells itself in a certain context, and taking it out from there and putting it into a gallery context and relating to the blood, sweat, and tear nature of show business, and at the same time to the handicraft, the handwerk of what is actually at stake. So what is actually the effort you physically have to do as a person if you want to perform climbing up a pole, which is extremely complicated actually and quite difficult. So I, in a way, try to establish a certain vocabulary for what this sort of phenomenon or this genre is about and deconstruct it in its elements so that you can actually really experience what is behind this idea of a connotation, which I think can be very questionable. And so then this work has been modified in such a way that there is an installation which looks like a ballet studio, and instead of having the horizontal bar, there's a vertical bar, and there is it's an instruction piece. There is a video, 7 steps to pole dance, that I have there's hand drawings and steps how to perform certain elements, because this kind of technique of doing pole dance comes along with certain kind of, a bit like in the ballet where you have a certain basic vocabulary. And so I was interested in this relation in between the language of the ballet or the language of, for example, a pole dance, and to get this closer together. And so there, in a way, there was also a contract, which is part of how this work should be conceived and how it has to be transmitted and transferred as part of the overall artwork, and a ghetto blaster with a set of tracks of CDs that could be randomly played and that one could eventually perform to. And this is an installation that has been set, and then inside of this installation there was, on the opening, and I think in a few times during the show, a performance stage with 3 different dancers that also had to be non-pole dancers, but just other kind of dancers that would engage with this specific technique in a very technical sense.
And we'll talk later in the conversation more about the notations, the instructions, and how that travels through time. But maybe in terms of you and exhibitions, it would be great to hear more about the biggest exhibition you've done so far, which is actually, it included handwork, but it built on it and made it much bigger, which is the show you did at the Kunsthalle in Basel. There was also an auditorium space. There was also a participatory dimension. And interestingly enough, it worked when it was present, but as you said earlier today, it also worked when there was an absence. Can you tell us a little bit about this exhibition? And because I think it's interesting in relation to what, Dorothea von Hantelmann writes about this absence of ties with exhibition, which obviously also means very often that people spend very little time. I mean, on average, I think people spend 2 seconds in front of the Mona Lisa. So that sort of whole question of ties obviously also means how can we, do exhibitions where people spend more time. Can you tell us about that show in the Kunsthalle?
So when we did this show together, Adam and me, we sort of talked a lot about what is the celebrational moment of a performance, and then what is the kind of aspect that is behind that. And I was very interested in sort of the reality of making choreography and of making performance, and of as a dancer, you spend 10 hours a day being busy with your body, working actually on either scores or warming up or stretching afterwards. Or there is so much work there is to do in order to be able to perform something, even only if it's a 5 minutes long piece. So that was something I thought, this reality that is never comes along with an equal balance towards how much you get paid for that, I thought was interesting to put at stake and to sort of make visible. And as well, the celebrational moment of really performing it for an audience. So for me, in a way, I'm equally interested in the elaboration of work and in the presentation of it, and in the same time also in the preservation of it. So then, in that sense, this work functioned like this, that we had different performances over, I think, 2 months spread, and that the space would constantly change with regard to the setup of the new piece that would be set up for the next date when it would perform. And the performers there would be either working on elaborations of the new work, or they would be somehow technicians around building down the stage and so on. So there were different etappen, how do you say it in English? Steps in the timeline that would be visible in that sense.
Maybe a last question is one of the things you often mention, which goes through most of your pieces, is this duality, where you basically talk about the mysterious aspects of human expression and then the kind of regulated, more repetitive element. You said this morning maybe better than the mysterious is the kind of notion of the enigmatic. Can you tell us a little bit about this duality between this sort of enigmatic aspect and then the regulated, repetitive moments?
Okay, so I think profoundly I'm interested in like the mystery of a human person or a human being, and like what sort of constitutes the presence of a person. And presence is something very important when you work with physical people, like bodies on stage, because this is, I think there is a lot beyond an idea of a score, even though structures and scores and choreographic ideas may be very important and crucial, still it is people who execute it, and that's what you see, in my opinion. So in that sense, I'm very often very long busy with the casting of performers, because I find it somehow is almost 80% of my work to find the right people to do specific things. And in that sense, we were talking earlier on how would it be to pass on the work, or like how can the work endure in some way. And I think in that sense, it's also very important to think of typecasting, or like passing on an idea of typecasting and finding people who can transmit very specific information about a part or a role or an idea of a score, and how this has to be presented or performed or embodied and interpreted mainly. And also I think I'm personally interested in enigmatic realities that are not kind of things that I immediately understand as one code and one and only connotation that is stuck to it. I find it, I think, more interesting to reflect a moment longer about a certain reality. And often when a situation is staged in such a way that I do not immediately know where I am, I feel that I get more like dragged into it, and it stays longer with me ever after.
That actually leads us right away to our next speaker, to Laris Cohen, who also, with whom we discussed a lot in New York a couple of months ago, this idea of written instructions and how the work actually travels through instructions or non-instructions. So, but before we talk about that, I wanted to ask you the same question. Who are your kind of influences or heroes or inspirations when you started? What got you started?
Well, I was just home with my mother in San Diego before coming here, and I thought about this very thing recently. One of my first memories from age 4 was actually seeing a James Luna performance in San Diego, and so it was actually a lot of performance, like San Diego specific, and often Chicano performance of that time in the late 80s, early 90s that was hugely influential, I think, subconsciously. And then I went into very intense ballet training and planned to, not go to college and be a ballet dancer, and kind of moved away from visual art. But, then my interest in college came back to visual art performance and the meeting of that with dance at this moment when dance was being reincorporated into visual art economy and discourse. And so, at that point I was, I studied both in school and at first I was trying to figure out how to have one practice be applicable to both sets of discourse and work in both economies and have it be the same work. And I quickly realized that wouldn't happen, or that couldn't happen, and that I had to create 2 different sets of work for each context.
And where would you say, what would be the first piece where you kind of found your language? Where would your catalogue raisonné start? What's the kind of, what would be the first piece where you found your language? What would be the number 1 in your catalogue raisonné?
I think it was this piece called Coda at Sculpture Center in New York, where I had built a sprung dance floor and changed the orientation, mounted it on a wall, and it was a very long stretch in a narrow corridor. So it was almost 78 feet long and 4 feet wide, and had a black Marley patina. Marley is the standard dance vinyl covering a stage, and I made it double sprung, so its depth was greater than the typical dance floor, and I was thinking about its relationship to function and having it being both too functional and yet a painting at the same time, and then how that as an art object could be compromised by the performance itself, and how it could work in service to the performance. And so kind of like dispersing the main event or the main object, or calling into question what was in support of what, so that it's not just a set, the floor, but also wasn't an autonomous object.
Now, like Alexandra, you also, entered the world of galleries and exhibitions and museums. There was a project, I think, in Thomas Urban Gallery. Can you tell us what happened there? How did you translate the practice into, and did you work there with the duration of an exhibition, or how did it work?
I mean, it was a short exhibition. It was over a few weeks, but yeah, that was, I think, the first time that I was thinking through how to make the performances be these, nodes across, and to kind of track the length of an exhibition, and to have the space change as a result of the performances, have the performances be an action of, to work on the space through the performance. And in that piece, I recycled the sprung floor from Sculpture Center and returned its orientation to its kind of intended horizontal positioning, although it was then stacked and unusable again. And I had inverted the black dance floor and turned it into a wall, and so in this piece I then was working with slabs of white wall used as a floor for ballet jumps, which I then jumped through the sheetrock, and it was a pretty simple conceptual inversion, and so I tried to kind of work against my own formula too, with how I could then push wall against wall and not have it just be a simple inversion, I guess.
And how would you then talk about this whole idea of instruction? Because I found some notes this morning from our first meeting when you explained to me about written addendums, about labeling and kind of instructions. And Alexandra spoke about this. And as Pierre Boulez says, there is the scar, but then there is the scar of the scar. There is all this additional information. It's kind of interesting because we went to see Pierre Boulez again a couple of weeks ago, because he obviously there was this big exhibition, this big performance of Boulez in the same space where now 14 Rooms is, and Herzog de Meuron, the same architects, did the display. And when we visited him, he again said, with scars, there is so much more than scars. It's all these additional information. So I'm very curious, because I didn't remember precisely how your written addendums, labelings work. If you could explain that to us.
Well, as far as instructions, I guess my work is kind of stubbornly site-specific, and that it's not meant to travel, really. And I think that's part of the challenge also of being here, and not having shown in Europe before, and having very piecemeal documentation available or not, mostly not. And so as far as the written instruction, most of the scores I carry in my own memory, and I have intentionally not written them down, because in performance I'll kind of perform my own archive or like regurgitation of the archive, I'm the kind of failed keeper of the score, and where I have lapses in memory becomes like the new historicization of the piece, a kind of like self-narrative of the piece, the past work. But you mean the labeling? Okay, so I guess in my labels I include a materials list, or I have in the past. I think this might change soon, but in exhibitions that have called for a wall label with a materials list, I've often listed the word transsexual, which in the past had meant to talk about my body, but it was mainly to let the viewer know that it was to foreground the importance of the performance and to let the viewer know during gallery hours that what you're seeing is not the extent of the work. So I wrote, sprung floor, dancing transsexual, sprung floor, comma, dancing transsexual for the materials for that piece, Coda, just so you know that there's something else that you're missing, or you might try to find the dancing transsexual in the floor itself. But as I continued to work with that word as a materials and as a material and change the way I list things, I found it. I started repeating the word transsexual and changing the way, like having one material listed twice in a different incarnation. For example, fog was listed as carbon dioxide for a subsequent performance, but so it was just chemical transformation of the same material. And so I was interested in how transsexual could also be not just an adjective, or a noun, but a verb, and how the words could modify themselves. A transsexual, and also that it wouldn't necessarily name a discrete human body, but could name a broader expanse of material. And also just because, contrary to Alexandra, I'm not so interested in human psychology or the mystery of the human body. It's a very low priority for me, and my own kind of, I feel very disembodied often personally, and I think putting that, that's at odds with, I guess, my history as a ballet dancer, and I find that tension to be useful, to force myself to perform, even though it's something I don't enjoy, actually, and to make the other materials kind of more important and to fill in the gaps with bodies.
Thank you very much. So you both told us about your exhibitions also, and that leads us right away to Xavier Le Roy. Obviously, you all, who needs no introduction, you all know, his pioneering work in choreography. What we want to talk today about is more, Xavier, your work with exhibitions. And our whole dialogue with exhibitions started in a very wonderful way in Antwerp in '99, but it started actually earlier on with a crisis, because we had invited you with Klaus Wiesenbach to the Berlin Biennale, and I think that was the kind of very first time you were invited in an art show, and I think it led to a quite traumatic situation. So I thought we could maybe start with that and with what went wrong.
The trauma.
Yeah, the trauma. Let's start with the trauma.
Well, if I remember well, I was pushed to make a video. There was a whole thing, invitation of making a performance for the for the show, and it was not possible for you to have only this moment of the show, and something should stay during the whole time of the exhibition. So I was very reluctant to it, but somehow give it a try and made this video out of the work I presented, and it was horrible. It was horrible. It was this video projected on the wall, and you would come in and you would see this, and where it starts, where it ends is like nobody knows, and it simply makes no sense. It's really, and after that, I never did it again. Yeah.
But then with Laboratorium, we found a solution, because in some kind of way the idea of actually representing or documenting the work in a show wasn't the way we tried again with the Musée d'Art Moderne when I was in Paris. But by that time the trauma was so big that you refused to participate. So we had a lot of unrealized collaboration. And then in '99, when we did Laboratorium, we sort of found a way. And I wanted to ask you to tell us about that piece.
Yeah, that's interesting that you, when you say, I was thinking about what was at stake for Laboratorium for this invitation. So I was working together with 20 people on the project which was called Extensions. And some of the basis of it was to do something that would try to include all the parameters that are involved in the production of a performance. In other words, to try to find ways where there would not be separation between the moment you research, the moment you rehearse, the moment you show the work, or other kind of separation where, as byproduct, explored also was the separation between the public space, like the space for the audience and the space for the performer. So, in order to work on this general idea, one important thing was to avoid going in the places where you rehearse and the places where you show the work. So we worked in places that are not theaters and that are not dance studios or theater studios or places for rehearsal. And that's how I proposed to work in a gymnasium, like Turnhalle, how you say in English? Gym, like school gyms. And that was the first important thing that led to the format that could work with an exhibition, but actually outside of exhibition space. The second important thing was to try, in order not to separate, to do everything at the same time, and use the time of work as the time of all these parameters. So I propose that we work 7 hours a day, 5 days a week. It was also in relationship to a moment where in France there was this proposal of the government to say we should work less, so 35 hours a week and not 38 or 40. And I thought this was an interesting model to use, to say like, okay, we also work, and if we use this time, this is the time we do everything, the research, the rehearsal, and the presentation of the work. So the project developed during weeks, and we did 2 weeks or 3 weeks in laboratorium, I don't remember exactly. And so it was literally days of work, which were days of opening of the exhibition. It's interesting now to think that it was like through an escape of every representation room that we somehow re-enter this field of exhibition, and the first time for me, at least, to work on this idea of a duration that is not made out of there is no appointment. You can come and go whenever you want, and there is always hopefully something going on that would bring all this activity together.
Now we all had, assumed that that solution was the solution, that to bring your practice into the museum was the wrong proposal, and then all of a sudden something quite extraordinary happened last year, that this exhibition popped up in Barcelona. Not only did you enter the museum, but you entered the museum with fanfare, with a very, very big solo exhibition taking over the entire Tapies Foundation in Barcelona. Now, several people thought that, you now brought dance into the museum, and you said in the interview yesterday in the art newspaper that cannot be the case, because how could you bring dance into the museum when before that you were categorized as a non-dance person? That would be a paradox. So I wanted to ask you a little bit to tell us about how, as a non-dance person, you dealt with this Tapie Foundation invitation and developed that, very big exhibition, and how you then solved what in 96, 97 with the Berlin Biennial, seemed an impossibility.
Yeah, when I got this invitation from Laurence Rassel at the Fondation Tapies in Barcelona, she didn't ask me to bring dance in her museum. That's for sure, and that's probably the last thing that she would ask me. And that was never my intention. And it's interesting for me to hear that this is what is trying to be put on that work. So that, but that's not the intention, and it also shows a very, I almost say, painful limitation of wanting to to separate disciplines. Like, should we still talk about this? Like, why should it be categorized as such? I hope that the experience that people do in the exhibition is of another kind. So yeah, it's also for me funny to hear this when I have started to do dance. I was put in the category of non-dance, whatever that means. But so. But what should I say? Should I talk about the show, or
yeah, I think it would be great for everybody who hasn't experienced the exhibition, because something quite extraordinary happened when one entered. The viewer became a trigger, and it would be great to hear how you constructed it.
Maybe to link with the introduction and something you said from Dorothea von Hantelmann, which this individual ritual. I think what the work tries to do is to confront this relationship that is produced by the theater, where something happened only because you are there. If there is no spectator, there is no show, or so you address. And the opposite in the exhibition, the painting is always there, also when nobody is there. And I think for me this comes together with the relationship to the individual and the group. The work in the theater is always addressed to a group, and I think what I try to do is to bridge these two things and produce something where the idea of there is a necessity of a community for the work to happen. It can also happen for yourself as an individual, but it's definitely another experience when it produces these groups. There is several moments in a show where you can be like the five of us watching something. We become a sort of a theater audience, but the theater audience, so this little community, is made out of people that are not so anonymous, which is I think what is specific also in the theater. You sit in the black and you sit in dark, and you don't know who is there. So there is something that I think that is happening, or I see happening between the exclusively individual experience that is happening in the exhibition space, but it's also happening in the theater as you are very anonymous and by yourself, and producing this moment where you have another kind of community that cannot happen in the theater, from my point of view, which is not so anonymous. So in a way, it's trying to it's a bit undo this individual ritual. I think that's what the work.
Can you maybe tell us about the whole part, how such a piece could travel or will travel through time? Because we talked about, instructions, and Alexandra and Yves talked about, these aspects of also the score. And I was kind of curious how you deal with that, how actually, these in 50 or 100 years could be ever either restaged or revisited. How does it travel through time?
So for now, it travels through times by me traveling to the places and meeting performers, dancers that do the work in the places where I go. And this will have an end. I will die. So maybe that's also okay. If we want to think about if that should continue, I think I would like to look for a way that there is a transmission of, like, there is the past, like finding a way that the knowledge or this experience is passed and is included in the work. So I was thinking about including in the work something that you pass, like you pass movement, but you pass also ideas and So maybe it's a way of making it travel in time, which would be also giving up totally any idea of controlling if it's done correctly or not correctly, which is an idea I'm very attracted to. Yeah, maybe that's what should do.
And are there any books involved? Because I think one of the key differences is, from the art world to the world of choreography, the art world has a great obsession with books, and books are very important for artists, and books play a kind of a smaller role in the world of choreography. How did this? I mean, it's a very important exhibition. Is there a catalog in Barcelona?
No, there were no catalog in Barcelona. There is now a book. Which is made after the show, but it doesn't function really as a catalog, because it collects texts that have been, like, a lot of interviews about the works that are involved in the show. So it's a collection more of this. It's more like a tool for people to work with, and it's also something that I give to the performers when they work on the show to read as information. So it's not really a catalog, but it's a book. It's a first book.
Great, thank you so much. Now, Isabel, maybe to begin with the beginning, how did it all start? What were your inspirations and influences? And also, when we met for the first time, actually, with Isabel Lewis, you mentioned Xavier being a great inspiration. So it'd be great to hear a bit more about that, and who were other inspirations in your practice?
Sure. I would say Xavier, definitely you were one of them at some point. This came later. If I think about earlier beginning, I mean, it's fun to answer this question in different ways every time it comes, but so I'll give you something new this time, Hans Ulrich, since you've asked me this before. Something new is I was at a young age, very influenced, of course, by classical ballet. And the whole stage spectacle, also Ballet Russe, Nijinsky, the idea of Rite of Spring, the Afternoon of a Faun, Swan Lake, Firebird, all of these kind of amazing stage spectacles that also carried along with them sort of all of these myths of the theater and of the stage. In this I was studying classical ballet for many, many years, but I was also reading, as you're saying, also lots of books, different books, and I would say if I was thinking now, sitting here, waiting, speaking fifth in this choreography, that like Franz Kafka, Albert Camus, William Gibson, so science fiction, a lot of science fiction was kind of, so these things were mixing as well with these kind of mythological, classical ballet images. The idea of also telling a story through the body, which I found compelling as like a young dancer and aspiring ballerina at the time. And then, of course, at 15 or 16, there was a club that I started to go to in Sarasota, Florida, called The Vibe. It was they had a teen night at this hip-hop club, and they would have all the newest hip-hop songs that were the most popular. They would have wet t-shirt contests, which seems slightly inappropriate for 16-year-olds. And this was also really a trigger. You used this word trigger, Hans Ulrich. I liked it because it was triggering something for me. How do I bring these worlds together? My interests, my kind of nerdy interests, and all of these books written by men, all of this girly ballet world, all of the contemporary sounds of the Dirty South, hip-hop music. How do I bring all of these things together? So these were, I would say, early triggers of mine. And of course, then later, an interest in contact improvisation, game structures for music composition, John Zorn, Xavier, Jérôme Bell, and of course, many other choreographers, both in New York and in Europe along the way. I was sort of hungry for all of it because more and more, the older I got, and studying ballet and dancing in different kinds of dances as well, I became more and more interested in format. and how to deal with the experience of watching something live.
Now, obviously, a lot has also to do with kind of using previous works, and it's almost like a meta level or a self-referential level, and that's something which is in Strange Action, for example. Can you tell us a little about this? And I was also very curious, I mean, because you obviously grew up with the internet, to which extent the internet plays a role in your work?
Yeah, I would say definitely a lot. From I guess the age of 15, there's a home computer, and then I was surfing the internet very slowly at that time, and was definitely highly influenced by that, in the sense of perhaps this networked thinking, and again this kind of collaging of different elements, also from pop culture. And various aspects, I guess, of culture. In Strange Action, the two main figures in the piece called Strange Action are Mr. T in the first half and Nicole Kidman in the second half, and I sort of become semi characterizations, I guess, of these two figures, and sort of use them in contrast to one another to kind of talk about the experience of doing something live. Because Mr. T, for me, is like, how many layers of persona is he? So he's Lawrence something or other is his real name, who then is Mr. T, a club bouncer, who then became B.A. Baracus on the A-team, and at which level is he operating? This reminds me of, Eve, what you were saying about often feeling disembodied, and this is something I think really interesting for dance. I find that often dance, it's thought of in this kind of essentializing, holistic way, and I think for me, this idea of Mr. T, also Nicole Kidman, and Strange Action brings this kind of different levels of self, certain different conflicting also ideas of the body and of the persona together. And Nicole Kidman in the second half of Strange Action seems to be a figure that actually never somehow disappears into her role in film, I find her kind of very mediocre actor, and seems to me that she actually never disappears. No matter what role she plays, she's always Nicole Kidman. So I found kind of contrasting these two figures interesting in this kind of talk. Strange Action is a kind of a talk about what it is to kind of make and compose and perform in the life.
You stated previously that dance creates sympathetic bodies, the ability to actually sense concepts and ideas. Imagine if everyone had a sympathetic body. I was kind of wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about what's the concept of the sympathetic body.
Yeah, I find the dancer an interesting figure in our culture, because someone who really is working on embodiment and working on researching through the body, not kind of keeping this idea of research or the process of research as a kind of intellectual or disembodied function, but is rather really using experience in a radical way to sense and think and feel the world. So I find this sympathetic body is something that I think that what the dancer actually trains. It trains a certain sensitivity, responsiveness, a certain kind of softness and openness that can react and respond to a kind of changing world. So that's what, for me, what a sympathetic body is.
Alexandra, even also Xavier told us about the way they use the exhibition as a medium, and I was kind of wondering if you could do the same. And I mean, we had this experience with your work for the Serpentine Marathon, so that was an appearance, but that had more the sort of duration of maybe 15 minutes. But then obviously an exhibition has another duration, but you're working now on something I think with Nico Laris, which goes more into this direction of actually a time frame of an exhibition. Yeah, it would be great to hear how you entered the world of exhibitions, and if you could tell us a little bit more examples about these different works.
Sure. For me, I find that the work I'm doing now, I call them occasions, and I don't think they belong either to the exhibition format or the stage format. the occasion is a kind of arrangement of things and bodies and different kinds of bodies, human bodies, plant bodies, bacterial bodies, animal bodies, food bodies, and it's an arrangement of these things in time. The occasion also lasts for an appropriate amount of time. So that's also a very fluid notion in the sense that if there's energy, if this arrangement of people and things kind of generates a kind of energy, then that occasion should last as long as that energy is there. So in a couple of occasions I've already hosted, that's been 2.5 hours, 4 hours, but I could imagine that could as well last 30 minutes. Somehow the notion of the occasion is that its time is somehow appropriate to its energy and the energy that it's continuing to produce. So I guess that would be my answer. It's a sort of format that I don't see it as actually part of the exhibition format precisely, although it does rely, I would say it brings things, or it's interested in this individualized ritual, but it as well a collective experience. So it wants to bring both of these kinds of rituals together, actually, in the occasion.
And that is actually, thank you very much, a wonderful opening to the more general conversation. I wanted to, before we open it up to the floor, ask you a few questions to all of you. And obviously don't hesitate, to interact with each other if anything urgent pops up as well. The thing is, basically, the format of the occasion is obviously a hybrid between an exhibition space and an event space, to quote once more Dorothea Hantelmann from her extraordinary vignettes. And I was kind of wondering, as we've spoken about the way all of you enter the world of exhibition, how you feel about this idea of there being new hybrids, if there may be hybrids which are, as Isabel, you described it, we need maybe neologisms. Cedric Price always said, we need new words. Maybe neither the word, exhibition, certainly not the word performance, are right for what you're doing anymore. We need neologism. So it would be great to hear from all of you about these hybrids. And then also, in addition to that, if such hybrids, would need new institutions, because we've just made this amazing experience, in Venice, where we kind of revisited in the Swiss Pavilion the Fan Palace, and it was so fascinating to hear from so many artists and architects, what could actually be a new institution for the 21st century. So maybe, Xavier, we can start with you. How do you feel about this idea of being these hybrids, what Isabel calls occasions, which are neither exhibitions nor events, but kind of both, and what kind of institutions, new institutions, do you think would there be needed?
I don't see this as hybrid. Like the show in the Tapies Foundation is an exhibition. It uses different means, different medium, different like actions, talks, dance. But I still see it as it is not a hybrid in my point of view. I do an exhibition. When I do a piece in the theater, I do a theater piece or a choreography. It's for me important to go through these conventions somehow in order to be able to search this line of separation I was talking about before, like this when the private becomes public, or you can go also objects, subjects, nature, culture. This all the things that we are constituted by, but I think also all the things that one tries to transform because they are unbearable after this categorization don't work all the time. So we need to. So I think instead of looking for new terms, I rather use the convention, and in order to look for how this line of separation between, let's say, performance and exhibition is transformed in something else. But this should be something else to come. And this should not be something else that is called blah, blah, blah. because then I know already. I don't need to do.
And Yves, how do you feel about that? Would you agree with Isabel that there is this new hybrid, or would you agree with Xavier that we need to work through these conventions?
I'm more in Xavier's camp here. I very much cling to the word performance, actually, and the word dance. I think it's important and useful, and I think, it's more interesting to me to work within constraints and pervert them than to look toward this kind of hybrid vanguardism and search for. I mean, also, I think it's unfortunate the way that performance is relegated to the domain of the event as a kind. I mean, that already has a certain duration and set of social relations implied. And it's, again, like this nodal point that's often to the side of an exhibition and something that's in support of the work, but it's not considered work. Or it's, so, I mean, I agree.
But nevertheless, we need new institution for that too.
How would they look?
That's your work.
I think
Alexandra, it's your turn. Would you agree with Xavier, or?
I think it's wrong to think of institution and what's the host. I think most important you have to think of what is the work and what are the ideas that you want to express and communicate. And with regard to that, find the structures, the people, the audiences that you need to address and how do you address it. So I am more interested in a dialogue and in the action of doing something among people, for people, or that can be shared or that can be presented. And in that sense, I totally agree with their conventions are necessary to get a sense of orientation and to understand how something is read in some ways. And in that sense, I think it's also interesting to question that and to build it up bit by bit or with an extreme gesture even. But the idea of hybrid is a bit delicate to me because also often one gets so much judged in terms of when you're a choreographer, you're dancing in the visual art field, so that's a hybrid. I think it's totally vague in terms of what that means. And I think it's really important to look into what is it that people do and analyze that in the first place.
And this idea, or maybe Isabel, you want to say something more?
Yeah, I was just curious a little bit about, for you guys kind of against this, I'm not sure about the word hybrid, but let's say creating kind of a new language to talk about these things. Like, how do we not reinforce the kind of value system that invents the exhibition if we kind of continue to reinforce those notions in the work, even if you're kind of trying to recreate or redefine what the exhibition is? How is it that you're not somehow reinforcing this very kind of worn out division of the senses, the kind of dominance of the visual? How are you sort of not reinforcing that by continuing to kind of work inside of these frames?
Well, you reinforce in any case, also when you hybrid. The only way is when the hybrid is producing something that is unrecognizable as the part that have been used for the hybrid, that you escape this. But it's the same. It's for me, it's another scale of where you place the convention. As I understand what you do, you use other conventions.
Yes.
It's not out of the convention.
Absolutely
it's not like, hello, now I will do occasion. What is this?
So
no,
people know what an occasion is, a social occasion, is a kind of gathering. So it's very much a convention.
So it is not out of this. It's I don't know. This is this is for me impossible to conceive. But there is, in both cases, the necessity, as I understand, of transforming. But it's two strategies. But they don't necessarily exclude each other from my point of view.
Alexandra and Yves, do you want to comment on that? Something?
I agree with what he says.
I'm curious also about the kind of individual agent as audience member with the ability to come and go as they please, and how attrition works in your works, if that's okay, and when is it okay. I'm completely offended by and absolutely loathe that sort of thing in my own audience, and like audience coming and going, like having a porous. I don't want to have porous boundaries around my work, and I want to very much have a captive audience, and that is a kind of old school theatrical convention, and so. Going back to hybridism, I guess like I impose kind of theatrical, they're like formal elements of the theater that are transposed into an exhibition space, and that could look like something hybrid, like a merging of the two. But I think by calling it an exhibition, again, it's about like perverting the conventions of the exhibition rather than creating this blend.
I think also there is in a way, the audience is a different audience in the theater or in a museum. In a way, the expectation is another, and I find that very interesting to address. I mean, when you make something in a theater, you know the audience sits down in the dark and expects something to happen to them in a way that they consume, or that's the way I perceive theater audiences. And when you do something in a museum, I feel there is a somehow more open approach towards whatever you do, because people rather tend to analyze what it is that they see right now and less expect a certain form or a certain kind of duration. So in that sense, I feel also when you're working in the visual art context, you're more free with regard to the timeline or the kind of dramaturgy setting that you propose. And then in a way, you also know what that means in terms of people. I mean, if you don't want audiences entering and exiting, then that's also an announcement that one can make in a way, no matter in which context.
And Xavier, yeah.
Well, I see it as the relationship you have to duration. If the good thing of theater and the use of duration also in an exhibition space is that you pull out the visitor out of the timeline and the imposed time that we live in, and that's what from my perspective exhibition cannot do. When I go visit an exhibition, I am not at all. I am bound to. I have the next meeting, or I can only spend 10 minutes here. If I go in the theater, I assign the contract that I can still use my phone and do things during the show, but it's the chance are restricted. So for me, it's the tension between these two things that are at stake.
Maybe that's a good moment. I've got some last questions afterwards, but it's a good moment to open it up. Are there any questions for Alexandra, for Isabel, for Xavier, for Yves? Hendrik?
Yes. Hendrik Focus, a curator working for the Stedelijk in Amsterdam. First of all, I'd like to thank you all for your wonderful contributions. It's been really interesting hearing all your perspectives, and especially because all of you have been working sort of in those two sort of disciplinary structures. You know, on the one hand, theater and dance, and on the other hand, sort of the exhibition structure. I wonder, like, even if there has been an outburst, really, of sort of performance in the visual arts, and definitely many of them focusing on dance. I know the theater has a very strong infrastructure, obviously, for showing dance and performance, and also a very strong economy to support it. I was wondering, I see your hesitation, and you're also right in sort of doubting that. But I'm wondering, does the visual art already have that kind of infrastructure to really support performance in that way? I'm curious as to hear your thoughts and sort of pick your brain on that, because I also feel that sort of the emphasis on sort of scores and documentation and what remains and the sort of commodification of sort of performance in that sense is a way for the visual arts to create that economical support structure for performance, whereas, you know, we might be looking in other directions as well for that. So I hope I'm making sense, and whoever wants to answer can take the mic.
Could you clarify, in the preservation or creation of scores, you mean as a way to kind of monetize the performance or generate?
Absolutely. I mean, it's quite simply as a way for museums, for example, to acquire the performance object.
It's a tricky one. I mean, I guess I can only answer from the perspective of the work I'm making at the moment, which I don't define even as a piece. I think of it as a format that's in ongoing development. So I actually try to avoid the objecthood or the stabilizing of it as a thing or as an object, which of course makes your question very difficult to answer. All I can say is that there seems to me something very archaic about the sort of ticket sales for a theater, and to sort of walking into a theater and sort of having this singular focus on one thing for a duration of time. And what seems exciting about the museum or the gallery, at least now, is that this kind of access that sort of at any time anyone can also enter into this experience and have an experience without having to go through this process. So I'm not sure what kind of monetization of the thing. I don't know how to answer your question. I guess I can only point out what I find kind of problematic and archaic about that of the theater, and what's positive, at least, about the museum or gallery format in that sense.
I think there is a need of a shift between to acquire something and to show something, and when you have a work that unfold with live actions, the shift should operate in order to make it possible, because you can maybe acquire. So what we have: documents, scores, but and then these scores are somewhere, but nothing is shown. So I think, and I don't see. I see there resistance. It's difficult. It's much more easy to make also not, but to make a work that pre-exists and you perform once in the museum. This is one, but this is the same economy as the theater. You tour, you show a work, but when you have a work that is unfolding as an exhibition, and so requires a long time, so requires paying people for a long duration. Of course, a score of that piece is much easier to keep in the drawer than to, and that's the shift that should operate. So the new institution should have as a functioning like an amount of means that is employing and giving work to people that can show the work, that can make the work happening. But this is not yet happening, but I think Hans Ulrich will take care about this in the future.
It's also a little bit what we discussed this morning. I mean, I think the world of theater is rather an economy of wages, and the world of art one of speculations of a kind. And in that sense, I think presenting something in a museum, the museums usually don't have the infrastructure that theaters have. For example, when you ask a museum, where's the dressing room, they look at you like you're crazy. And dancers will ask, I mean, me being a choreographer, working with people that dance in my work, they will all ask me, where's the dressing room? Where are my per diems, and so on and so on. So there is a certain convention with regard to the mechanisms of how we still produce today, which has to do with paying people in a certain way and touring in a certain way, organize conditions for people on tour. that is expected, and you have to somehow stand up to it. And so it's a constant negotiation with every space. But that's what Xavier said before. It's like we treat museums the same way we treat theaters in a way. So we go there and we perform, and there's a certain price for how a work is somehow sold inside of the system. But if the museum wants to buy the work, I think then it comes along with what we discussed before, with a whole set of instructions that have to do on the one side with the score, with video documentation, with photography, with passing on the information from a person to another person that will take personally care of the casting. And if this person has a car accident tomorrow, what then? And so on. So you have to, in a way, secure everything on so many levels that it gets extremely tiring to think of this possibility at all. And then I think there is a crucial question of what Xavier said earlier, like, do you really want to control this? Or like, is it interesting to control so much how work is passed on and in what way? And personally, I think maybe for some of my work, I'm interested in it. And for some other work, I don't want to put it under that kind of pressure, because I like the fact that it has been an action in time.
Is there anything, Eve, you would like to add?
Just that, the theater is not a monolith, and that, at least in New York, there's a really clear division between, the kind of uptown commercial presentational dance world and the nonprofit companies that support that work, and then the dissolution of the company model downtown, and the very small commissions and those projects that rely heavily upon grant writing. And so in that way, the dance economy isn't really better equipped to produce performance than visual art. I mean, it depends on the circumstance, but for example, I'm doing a work, right, or I'm working on a project where I need to strip the theater of all of its lights and risers, and just to remove all of that and then reinstate it after I'm gone is a tremendous cost, and that exceeds the commission that's being given. So I'm having to write grants and so forth. But also just in terms of like rehearsal and dancer wages, leading up to the performance, like the 10 hours a day. I wrote that down earlier, and that feeling so far away in my life, just because of how I've had to adapt to these different economies, and knowing that I won't be compensated often for that work, and so I've kind of eliminated rehearsal, basically, and the performance itself is the rehearsal, which is a kind of old school visual art performance of the 60s and 70s mode of working, and I do mean to call that forth, but yeah, anyway, but this question of whether, what produces what, is my practice responding to these material conditions, or how can performance produce new material conditions, new audiences? These are something I'm turning that around in my head a lot lately.
One thing, Hendrik, your question also brought to my mind is actually the first artist I ever met when I was like 16 or, in Switzerland is the playwright Eugène Ionesco, and he was a quite, old writer by that time and had stopped writing his amazing plays. I mean, he's one of the pioneers of absurd theater. And he was walking, in the streets of St. Gallen doing some prints there because he had stopped, doing theater, and made some, it's kind of interesting, they're almost like children drawings, what he did at the end. It sort of went back to the beginning. And so we had a coffee, and for me it was a kind of an unforgettable experience, because he sort of said, whilst he has this coffee with me that evening in Switzerland, in Paris, once more, his Cantatrice show of The Bald Singer, which is one of his most famous plays, is performed, and it's been performed for 30 or 40 years, every single night. And obviously, it's been going on ever since. I think, if I'm not wrong, it's still being performed today, every single night, in Paris, 365 days a year. And so then he made a joke, and he said, I see public sculptures in bronze come and go, because, they're there for 10, 20, 30 years, and then they're moved. And so he said, my play is actually maybe more permanent in Paris than a lot of these, he talked about the sculpture of César, who kind of was moved and, wasn't there anymore. So in a kind of an interesting way, that relates, I think, to your question, because I don't think really that it's that much a question of, only, for example, museums acquiring work. Because if a museum acquires a work, that doesn't by itself mean anything. It doesn't mean that it's then really, shown, that the situation is actually shown. It might just be somehow in the archive. So I think what is needed is probably a different logic. If we want have a similar, if in the future there is a similar presence of live art in museum as there is for sculpture and painting and video and moving image, which means not just in a program from 6 to 6:30, but at any time you visit a museum, will not be. It's not at all a question of the art market. It's not at all a question, the opposite of speculation. It is an endowment. What is needed is an endowment. It's the logic of an endowment. And we could imagine, if a museum has an endowment, that actually a work could be shown every day for the next 100 years. I think, and that's a kind of what we discussed also at breakfast this morning, is something which could be very, interesting. Are there more questions? Yeah, there is a question here.
Hello, my name is Gaël Kleino. I'm sound and visual philosopher. I have a question about more maybe turning for the institution, in the sense of I observe around me from some years now the performer artists struggling a lot with all those kind of questions. What object you can bring for the museum market or blah blah blah, but what I can observe today with this form also more and more, it's totally linked about what happens in the present. And I heard that also in the discussion now. And how the institution can deal with just the present. And that's a question what's turning a bit in my mind in this context also, because I don't reject the idea of museum, but since I'm really young and small, when I go to a museum, it's more to see something like collected from the past, linked with a dead language many times, with all the history of actuality. And yeah, also, yeah, voilà, that's the point. If I'm not sure it's clear for everybody, but how the institution can deal with the present. Voilà. How?
Very difficult question. I cannot answer.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Cedric Price's Unrealized Fun Palace, raised this question. So it might be interesting for you, if you're interested in this question, to read everything, his writings of Cedric on the Fun Palace. He worked with a theater director, John Littlewood, and that was the idea of an institution which would permanently be in the present in many different ways, through fast and slow, moments, and through loud and silent moments, and there would still be the harvest for the quiet eye, but there would be. So I think that was very much in the center of Cedric thought. So there's an archive on that, but I don't know.
That also makes me think of one thing, which is these song lines that Australian Aboriginal culture have.
Bruce Chatwin.
Sorry.
Yeah, Bruce Chatwin's book.
I'm speaking just. I don't know this book, but the song lines which kind of reproduce, that keep the world alive. So there's sort of sequences of songs and dance that are memorized and passed down orally, and this is something that both connects to the past and also creates the present at every moment. So that's something interesting in terms of thinking of archive, rituals and oral traditions that sort of pass history and present and future, that sort of weave these things together and continue them, and in order to continue the world. So this is something that you were making me think of just now.
Well, and also what that brings up for me too is how the present really is illusory and an impossibility, but it's really prized within dance, especially in dance training and the yoga industrial complex, and like being in the moment, and like it's really connected to kind of like new wave ideology too, but how that now is then being taken up in visual art. And in a way, I mean, I'm kind of critical of this position from a dance pedagogical perspective, because it's only certain bodies are kind of capable of being in the present, again with this like feeling of disembodiment or feeling out of body, and that being particular to certain subjectivities. In my case, like being a trans person and not always feeling safe in my own body, and then having that being like prerequisite for dancing well or fulfilling your tasks in the classroom and dance, and then just how that maps onto I don't know. How that maps onto art collecting is something I still need to think through, but that's what it brought up for me.
One should also not generalize. There are different kind of institutions. Some deal with the present, some with the past, some with the future. That's for me what makes it difficult to. There are different kinds.
We can take one or two more questions.
The question is if any of us is performing during the time of Art Basel. I'm not.
No.
Not. Also not.
If there are no more questions, I've got many, many more questions left, so maybe I would ask you one or two last questions. One of the things, Xavier, I always remember when we met for the first time, you talked about slowness. In Antwerpen, and I found that in several interviews with the four of you, connections to slowness, and in a kind of a interesting way, it ties back to what we said at the beginning. This idea that the exhibitions at Ritual very often, is accelerated. People only spend 2 seconds, in front of the Mona Lisa. I'd be curious to hear a little bit more from the four of you in our accelerated times about slowness. Wants to start? Maybe Xavier, as you planted the idea.
No, I'm too slow.
And in the occasion format that I'm working with, I like to think about what are kind of hospitable conditions that can be generated that can cultivate a different sense of time, or also kind of provide hospitable conditions for a kind of experimentation with the self and with different attitudes and value systems. So this is something I spend a lot of time thinking about, not exactly how do I force somebody to give me more of their time, or how do I seduce them to give me more of their time, or to slow down, but how do I generate a situation that's somehow hospitable to at least a shift in thinking a little bit, to kind of move out of this kind of fast-paced consumer culture mode.
Yeah, I have also this necessity of slowing down. But I think it's a problem of how the time is imposed to me and to us. I don't want to generalize, but that's how I feel. Like this cutting the time, and how many time you say I don't have the time. I wish I could have time. I cannot give this time. I don't have the time. It's always so. The slowness is a way of maybe deviating from that. But I would, in this experience of the exhibition space, the slowness. I was thinking about like the slowness as a capture of attention. So yeah, there is a slowness that you might want or need to do as an action when you perform. This is one part, and I think that's things I have been through and I'm still in and interested in, like slowing down. So for myself and as an action, but it's something that you of course share when you show this to a public. But in the exhibition space, I think there is in terms of like the capture of the time you're talking about, like this necessity of like hold on, take your time, is yeah, it's also necessary to if you want to transform something, if you want to to produce something that is not able to be consumed in 2 seconds. So it comes with very violent, from my perspective, actually I feel it. It's very violent when you, in an exhibition space, do something that address a person and this person cannot leave because you talk, or it's really unpolite. So it's the slowness is I experience it as more and more violent somehow. Maybe from the time I was talking about slowness. And now, like 15 years later, it gets more and more violent.
For me, I think my interest lies less in slowness, but what I'm more concerned with focus in a way, and that does not for me necessarily come along with like slowing down. It could also come along with be compulsive over a very long time, or like try to create ultimate intensity so that also nobody can leave while they're watching. Or, I mean, it's in a way producing a similar effect, probably. Apart from personally, I'm very interested in slowing down in life. But that is, that's, I think for me, it's two separate things in a way.
Yes, slowness feels fashionable in dance right now, and you know, a lot. Actually, Andre Lepecki wrote about it in relationship to your work, right? And like dance is slower ontology, but I think I'm more excited about like suspension and a time warp, or like a bubbling of time, than slowness implies still a kind of unidirectional path, or like we're still on the same linear framework. And yeah, what happens when there's just an expansion or compression of time that produces something curvaceous? I guess that's how I prefer to visualize it.
Now, a very last question is the only recurrent question in all this panel. The question about your unrealized project. Now, you know, there has been this interesting, you know, not a disagreement, but different sort of point of views about, you know, do we need a new institution, or do we work with the conventions of the existing, you know, formats? No matter if either of these two, you know, is true, there are unrealized projects because they're projects which don't fit into any existing institutions because somehow it doesn't function within a context of, you know, a theater or a dance world or an exhibition format. I mean, it's kind of interesting that, for example, many of these shows we've been doing with the Manchester International Festival, if it's Tempo del Postino, like Postman Time with Philippe Barreno, or the 11, 12, 13, 14, you know, 15 rooms with Klaus Wiesenbach, we didn't really find a context for such ideas, neither in the art world nor in any other world, until this new festival was founded by Alex Poots. Actually, it was an idea of the artist Peter Saville when he became the artistic director of a city. So Manchester made an artist, you know, the creative director of their city, and that produced that festival where these transdisciplinary, you know, projects would be possible. So there can be projects which are unrealized because there isn't, you know, it doesn't fit within an institution. But then there are many other reasons why projects are unrealized. Projects which simply are too big to be realized, or too expensive to be realized, or, you know, are too small to be realized. Or projects which have been censored, or that would be another reason for unrealized. Or then Doris Lessing always told me we should not forget the self-censorship projects we simply haven't dared yet to do because they're too far out. So my last question to the four of you is, what are your unbuilt roads? Can you tell us about one or some of your unrealized projects? Maybe we start with Isabel.
Well, I guess I'll start by saying the sociologist Eva Illouz talks about sexuality as a generalized metaphor for desire in consumer culture. And that kind of places sexuality right in the center of kind of consumer culture identity. So the piece that I've been imagining, that I will continue to imagine, it will probably take quite some time to come to fruition, it's rather not. It's not actually a work or a piece, but again, in the occasion format, a hosted occasion, but with many hosts, in particular 4 women from Copenhagen that I've begun working with. And in this hosted occasion, the format is something between a kind of a strip club, a sauna, a symposium, a kind of 18th century salon, where it's a space of sensuality, sexuality, intellectuality, where these things can kind of commingle but without anxiety. So I find that always the kind of naked body, especially the naked female body, so fetishized, and there's so much kind of anxiousness, anxiety around these bodies. So I imagine as a space, an occasion, where the vibe is actually relaxed, and where perhaps maybe again, it's this hosted occasion. There's no separation then between the hosts and their guests. So maybe in this space, everyone it would necessitate like nudity on everyone's part there, and sort of, I know that somehow now to do such a thing would not be elegant somehow at all, and this anxiousness would be overwhelming. So it seems something that's kind of far away, and maybe also requires a kind of shift in sort of consumer culture consciousness in order to realize it.
Xavier?
I think project should be over. The imperative to have project make me try to have no project. So, and that's difficult. That's maybe the unrealized project. It's very, very difficult to escape this imperative. So that's my unrealized project, because I have some.
Yves?
Fresh in my mind is the piece I did at the Whitney Biennial this year, which was cut short kind of prematurely. I had planned a series of 5 performances for the construction site for the new Whitney building downtown, and specifically in the theater under construction. And I was kind of trying to locate the vanishing point when the theater becomes itself. And needless to say, I didn't find it. But yeah, I did 1 performance, and then because of a construction issue, the rest couldn't happen. And it got me thinking about my own process of, like, I discover what my work is as I do it, and that happens in the context of an exhibition over time. I had spaced out the 5 to kind of track the length of the biennial, and since only 1 had happened and the structure of each of the 5 performances was unique, I feel like I still don't even know what the work is, which is a kind of new and disconcerting experience for a control freak.
Alexandra?
Well, this morning I had a similar reaction like what Xavier just expressed on breakfast, but then because I somehow wouldn't want to know what is the project that I do not know yet. I'm actually quite happy not to know, which relates again to try to do things slower in life, basically. But when I was thinking about it now, I thought that I think I would be interested to think of storytelling and strategies of narration without making a movie, and that would be something I could wrap my mind around.
Wonderful. So I'd like to thank again everyone, above all also Marc Spiegler, and Art Basel, everyone at Art Basel, because it's a wonderful thing talking about slowness, that a panel can evolve over many, many years, because we've been doing this now year after year, exploring different aspects, of topics. And all our thanks go, of course, to the wonderful organizer. A special applause for Claudio Vogt. We were also very grateful to all the advisors for the wonderful conversation before the panel, to Tino Segal, to Klaus Biesenbach, to Assad Raza, to David Velasco, Simon Caste, and of course also we are very happy that John Caldor is with us here today. And all my thanks go to Alexandra, to Isabel, to Xavier, to Yves. Thank you so much. Thank you all.